Extreme politics in the United States. Partisan politics has always just been a strong, sometimes unyielding support of a person or cause, however oftentimes lacking critical thinking about the person or the cause. It is that lack of critical thinking by the extremes that makes it far too easy for you or anyone else to become ostracized for being far too left or far too right. With little or no overlap between polarized ends of a political spectrum, two distinct and extreme sides of political thought emerge, causing an ideological divide over civic, economic, and bureaucratic direction, ultimately leading to a complete breakdown of an ideological middle ground and violence. Often revealed openly and carelessly as animosity and prejudicial treatment towards those across the aisle, partisan politics, especially in recent years, has become increasingly vitriolic to the point of sustained violence in some major US cities. It's become overall something worse than mere partisanship. While one could make the argument that partisanship is good for democracy in a historical context, there is no denying that politics have recently become more and more toxic, and in some cases even more brutal, and well outside the purview of lawful. Even the political middle ground is a dangerous place to be, according to those clinging to a partisan end. If you hold an opinion that sways too far to the left, or just a little bit too far to the right, of a person with a rigid political leaning, you are the enemy and the problem. After all, you don't believe what they believe, do you? It didn't always used to be this way, and it doesn't need to be this way right now. Division equals separation, which is the path that the US is undeniably on as a nation. American history shows us that healthy competition, peaceful protests and demonstrations, negotiation, communication, and a strive for equality of opportunity are the best paths to ensuring everyone gets at least a little bit of what they want. While both extreme ends of US politics seem different, they're really quite similar, and always have been. Both can become misguided and dangerous. Zealotry on both sides comes down to lingering issues of skin color, and while the hard wiring is different, both sides are dominated by a victim complex and an authoritarian need for political power. Is America on its way to a new civil war, and are we already technically at the beginning of it? How do we re-establish a diplomatic middle ground to ensure everyone's voice is heard and respected, or is it already too late? What will become of what we once knew as the United States of America if an extreme political side emerges as victorious? And has that already happened? These are the questions surrounding the issue. I'm the Objectivist. Throughout all of American history, there are examples of passionate and widespread devotion to an ideological political cause, which has produced positive, some might say progressive results based on the will of the people. These movements helped in part to cast off the rigid shackles of tradition, some traditions that helped to lay the groundwork for society at the time. Here, in the Western Hemisphere of the planet, we celebrate the philosophy of freedom over the philosophy of order. Independence over the collective, questioning over acceptance, and innovation over repetition. Finding many of its strongest roots in ancient Greek philosophy, specifically Athenian democracy, America is a place where the power resides with the people, or at least in theory. Western cultures like America put an emphasis on the individual person thinking and expressing their thoughts externally, rather than being forced to keep their ideas internalized. While freedom of expression comes with negative consequences, it's also helped people to create more art, music, more creative writing, and more freedom of access to a desired lifestyle choice than its ideological Eastern opposition. Generally and historically speaking, the ideology of democracy in America has always promoted ideas like equality. It leans on the will of the public. It tries to protect the interests of citizens, and as a result, there's little chance of a revolution occurring under its democratic principles. Partisan politics in America originally came about when Americans came to question how powerful the government should be. The Federalists wanted a strong central government, while the Anti-Federalists advocated for states' rights. This schism led to the creation of America's first political factions, which led to conflict, clashes, and bickering on the issues of rights. At the time, only landowners had the right to vote, and to circumvent tensions, America's first political parties came into being to organize voices and movements for change in a rapidly expanding but culturally and economically speaking, weak and underdeveloped country. Federalists and the Republicans could be joined so that people would have a seemingly extreme but acceptable social bubble to express their ideals within. And although there were splits and arguments in the parties themselves, at least you were in a place with like-minded people. In a democracy, it can take a long time to make final decisions, because so many people have the right to express themselves. Even initial negotiations over details of issues like where to place the nation's capital and the creation of a first national central bank took years, over a decade each, to hammer out for the new democracy. President George Washington had a bit of trouble keeping political adversaries like Alexander Hamilton, a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, under control at the time, worried that their partisan political bickering was becoming more of a nuisance than a service to the public. This, of course, resulted in violence every now and then. One such political incident involved Richard Griswold, a Federalist, and Matthew Lyon, a Republican, attacking each other with canes and fireplace tongs on the floor of the House of Representatives on February 15, 1798. While both parties agreed to work together to an extent, frustration and fights continued between them, and even continued after Washington's tenure. While a mere reflection of its time, this was the beginning of partisan extremes in America. Now, let's fast forward 81,000 days into the future in America, 222 years later. Here we are on the precipice of another deeply divided election process, smack dab in the middle of a deeply divided nation, going through a pandemic. People are getting exhausted with Republican President Trump's unpresidential antics. Trump, who once oversaw the largest economic expansion in US history, is still serving as president during a pandemic, which seems to have brought his flaws as an administrator to the limelight. Trump will be competing against an incoherent Democrat, Joe Biden, who seems to be clinging to his ties to the Obama administration and mostly communicates in non sequiturs. And here is what is happening in America as all of this unfolds. Riots in Seattle. Rising crime rates in New York City. Over 90 days of pure bedlam in Portland, Oregon. Racial activists and looters take to the streets in Chicago and claim that looting is reparation for things that occurred hundreds of years ago in the country. Baby boomers brandish firearms at crowds of protesters entering gated communities, seeking to enact racial justice, a term that seems to have no clear meaning. If the mainstream media is to be believed, far-right agitators are everywhere, sycophantically clinging to Donald Trump as their last vestige of political power in a changing country. But is this really change for the better? What happened over 200 years where things ended up like this? After a hard-fought election in the year 1800, the Republicans emerged as politically victorious over the Federalists. The people had spoken, states' rights were enshrined, and the Federalists became more and more obsolete, or so it would seem. They simply faded out as an apparent political faction, losing the appreciation of the average American citizen. A common contention in US politics in the 1800s was how to bridge the northern and southern differences of one key issue, which echoes even in 2020, that being slavery. The transatlantic slave trade, which was very popular in numerous countries at the time, sent its first human cargo to Virginia in the 1600s. Almost all existing nations had some sort of ties to slavery at the time. Slaves from West Africa were purchased from African slave traders and shipped to locations all over the Atlantic, most slaves ending up in the Caribbean or South America to assist the physical logistics of booming economies. While parts of Britain formally fought to end slavery by 1833, the modern Republican Party in America was founded in 1854 to oppose slavery in the country moving westward. Congress in 1860 was dominated by Republican states to the north, while the southern states, dominated economically by the slave trade, walked away from the Union after tariffs were applied to southern goods, politically forcing citizens to buy northern manufactured goods. Although this may seem radically antithetical to the political ideals of today, Democrats were, at least originally, the party of Southern slavery. Even Dixiecrats, a segregationist party, emerged briefly because of their deeply Southern and anti-racial integration policies. Disenfranchisement of blacks was an economy that the South thrived on and thought they needed. Ideologically, the North and the South were at political extremes. War was a certainty. In probably the best and most taxing example of violence occurring as a result of extreme politics in the US, spanning 4 exhaustive years and taking place in battle sites all over the United States in both the North and the South, the Civil War in America took the lives of anywhere from 620,000 to over 800,000. It took the deaths of over 500,000 people to end this ideological, political struggle. The North simply won by superior numbers and a more industrialized production base to work with, but also, just like any war, by way of good planning and tactics to use superior numbers to an ultimate advantage. Its ideological political opponent, the politically unpopular South, lay in ruins, dominated militarily and economically. One extreme had emerged victorious. And this is when America slowly started to emerge as an empire, and everyone became Federalists again. A new era of federalism swept through America during the Reconstruction era. The South, despite its lingering issues with racism, would have to be integrated. An era of civil rights was upon the reforming and healing nation. Political equality for African Americans was baked into the ideals of the nation through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Abolition of slavery started primarily because of the efforts of 2 major powers, America and Britain. These were nations that found slavery to be antithetical to the ideals of freedom and freedom of expression. Even in terms of economics, slave goods weren't viewed as quality goods anymore. While previously only landowners in America had the right to vote, regular white men did not have the right to vote until at least 1856, with some black men being allowed the same right by only 1870. Black men were now citizens if they were born here. A major ideological war had just taken place, and new thoughts started to emerge. The National Women's Suffrage Association came about based on the idea of extending the "created equal" slogan to adult female citizens. The Civil War had inspired sweeping social changes, and a new kind of nation was emerging. However, changes in the South came in the form of Jim Crow laws, and slavery was merely replaced by racial segregation. Throughout all of the 1900s, America became a land of staggering political and social change. What would become modern consumer culture emerged. Millions of immigrants came in to sample American economic opportunities. A worldly consciousness came into being for America, cementing the US as a multicultural empire in the West. Social issues gave way to the Progressive Era. Women's rights evolved in the 1900s, leading to women getting the right to vote officially in 1920. When Susan B. Anthony, a feminist pioneer, went out and voted, she was fined $100, which at the time was a lot of money. But these peaceful political acts of nonviolent protest changed things for the better by highlighting the inequality in the system and helping to phase it out as obsolete or contrary to the emerging ideals of the freer country. Ideals like environmentalism and social justice were taking root in the zeitgeist of the age of American politics. Blacks were free from slavery and free to vote, and while the image of a distinguished colored man started to emerge in the public consciousness, Jim Crow remained whites only for a time. But at least the country was trying to change, trying to get better. Separate but not entirely equal, the people of the nation pushed forward. Partisan politics never reached a bloody civil war in the 1900s. But it did come in the form of socio-economic issues emerging as policies, leading voters to align under bipartisan coalitions. These voting blocs became increasingly influenced by big business interests and corrupted, gradually merging with federal power for decades. This would sometimes lead to the government having to step in and regulate the businesses, who would try to monopolize everything. Reforms were passed on issues that ranged from tradition to patronage, and entire parties were reshaped to adapt to the times. Although the Federalists had been long defeated, both Democrats and Republicans leveraged control under increasing federal powers during the early and mid-20th century, creating bureaus to oversee the functions and safety nets of rapidly growing economics in America. And the lines between Democrats and Republicans seemed to blur. Both parties were now becoming the parties of big government and big business. Only big government could provide big businesses with the infrastructure they needed to thrive, and only a big federalist government could take care of the people, who were at times economically downtrodden. The rise of the mainstream media in the US served to occasionally, and then increasingly, serve as a propaganda arm to the US federal government, another victory for the long-forgotten Federalists. Radio, newspapers, magazines, and televisions all began to shape and mold public opinions, sometimes to conform to the clearly corporatist agenda that it came from. America went through 2 world wars, the creation of the Federal Reserve, and the Great Depression. Cooperative federalism came along, leading to government deals on unemployment insurance, financial aids, Social Security, the New Deal. Republican states were becoming Democrat states. Democrats had been losing their bad image recently, especially when Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected in the 1930s, leading to the rollout of recovery packages and further reform during the era of economic crisis. Bipartisan politics blurred the lines of accountability in government. How could people trust their government officials when big government was getting so big and powerful and taking money from people who were so big and powerful? The 1960s was an era marked by protest, assassination, and urban riots, all while a push for sexual freedom and economic freedom of one particular sex was being pushed by left-leaning activists. The religious right still maintained vast amounts of power during the 1900s, and believed they could still tell women what to do with their bodies. During this decade, the South lost their fascination with Democrats, and the Republican Party became popular in rural areas and suburbs, Democrats now being strong in support in major cities in the US. Television and mass media dominated and shaped public opinion moving forward, guided by the money-making agendas of a handful of large companies. Several realignments from left to right had shifted the political landscape, and while some wanted to cling to the traditional American values of old, which had worked to a great extent up to that point, some wanted to move on, to change with the times, however slowly, or sometimes violently quick. Momentous things had happened to the young America. It had endured political, social, and cultural upheaval in the pursuit of the idea of people being more free. New majorities rose suddenly, and government as usual could barely keep up with the social changes. While neither of the parties had really switched belief systems, the Democratic South became the Republican South, and cities, some of them containing millions of people, became Democrats.
This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, and that the rights of every man are diminished, and the rights of one man are threatened.